I'm not going back.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender. We shall never surrender.
Dunkirk is known as the greatest evacuation in world history in the last 75 years. Dunkirk was fought from May 26, 1940 to June 4, 1940. The British and the French marked this as the point that World War II was actually starting. It was the end of the phony war.
The battle was fought on the beaches around Dunkirk, France. 33,000 British and French troops were surrounded and trapped on the beaches by the German army. The Germans had no choice but to use the Blitz to get them there and waited for Hitler's commands before finishing them off. That order, however, never came along, so all the troops escaped from the shallow water up the Thames and back to Britain. In total, around 933 ships and boats were used to get the men evacuated from the shores of Dunkirk.
Operation Daniella was the name of the evacuation. It was named after the Daniella room under the Dover Castle that supplied the building with electricity. It was also the headquarters of the British Royal Navy. The evacuation consisted of trying to get as many men off the shores of Dunkirk and back to safety. In the beginning, Churchill had only expected to get around 7,000 to 8,000 men back, but a total of around 350,000 British, French, and Belgian troops were rescued from the shores of Dunkirk. After this massive evacuation, this gave the Allies to continue the war and was a major boost to British morale. After the last rescue boats left Dunkirk harbor on June 4, 1940, the Germans captured around 40,000 French troops who'd been left behind, as well as another 40,000 British soldiers in the Dunkirk vicinity. The story of these men is often overlooked. Many people just wanted to look on the successful part of the evacuation of all the soldiers. For the next 5 years, until the war finally ended, large numbers of these men were mistreated, abused, in violation of the Geneva Convention guidelines governing the sick, wounded, prisoners of war, and civilians. As described in Dunkirk, the men they left behind by Jean Longden, some were even executed. These men were denied food and medical treatment, and the wounded were jeered at.
Canada played a major role in the battle and contributed in many ways. Canada was responsible for providing boats and sailors to help transport captured soldiers. Many Canadian citizens were even asked to provide large boats in an attempt of rescuing the soldiers. The Battle of Dunkirk was significant to Canada for many reasons. The battle was the evacuation and defense of Britain and its allied forces in Europe. France felt betrayed because the allied forces came to their rescue from Hitler in the Battle of France on the Western Front. Canada, who was associated with the Allied, joined forces to win the battle against Hitler. This plays a major role in Canada's history due to the fact that it portrays Canada in a new light. In addition to this, the Sending Canadian Infantry Division's 6th Brigade and the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division's 5th Brigade were the two leading participants from Canada. One individual named Robert Trimble stood out the most. He was personally responsible for the evacuation of 900 troops. With his extremely successful mission, he was the first Canadian to receive the Distinguished Service Cross. The evacuation ended on June 4, 1940, with a fair number of casualties.
The Battle of Dunkirk was fought by air and ground. If they had a chance, they would have definitely fought by the sea as well. The only problem was that the shores around Dunkirk were shallow and barely left by the fishing boats that were transporting the trapped soldiers on the shores. The war tactic that the Germans had used to back the British and French onto the shores was the Blitz. The Blitz was what they had called lightning war. It had consisted of non-stop attacking from bombs, air force, tanks, and ground troops. Many people don't understand why Hitler had stopped the Blitz, because if he didn't, it would have been more likely that they could have won the war. You can't replace 350,000 troops. Many of the Nazi soldiers were awaiting the order to continue, but the order never came. People have their own theories on why the attack had ceased. Some people say that Hitler thought that they had pushed them back too easy and let them go to have more of a fight. Some say that the Luftwaffe believed that they could kill all the ones who were escaping and left it to them. There are many theories, but we still never know the true intentions of why Hitler had never continued the order to attack. The total death toll of Dunkirk was around 68,000 for the British and 290,000 for the French, and neither of those numbers included the amount of soldiers that have gone missing or were taken by the Germans. The German casualties amounted to 27,074, and another 111,034 injured. In the effort to evacuate all the troops successfully and safely, a total of around 1,000 boats were used. At the end of the evacuation, a total of 6 destroyers, 5 minesweepers, 8 transport ships, and around 200 little boats had been sunk, and the equivalent amount of that was extremely damaged. The RAF and the Luftwaffe had also considerable losses. The RAF had won the battle in the sky, taking down more of the Luftwaffe and protecting the soldiers on the ships. The total loss for the Luftwaffe was 240 aircrafts, and the total loss for the RAF was 177 aircrafts. All these losses did not just include the ones that died on the battlefield and in the air. It also includes the amount that were sunk at sea and died in ship explosions from trying to be evacuated.
During the battle, the Germans had captured 2,500 cannons, 11,000 machine guns, 64,000 tanks, trucks, and armored cars, as well as 1,200 prisoners. In addition to this, they evacuated the majority of their strong troops. The British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, called the Dunkirk evacuation a miracle of deliverance.
Mr. Speaker, I asked the House to fix this afternoon, as the occasion for a statement. I feared it would be my hard lot to announce the greatest military disaster in our long history. I thought, and some good judges agreed with me, that perhaps 20 or 30,000 men might be re-embarked. But it certainly seems that the whole of the French First Army and the whole of the British Expeditionary Force north of the Amiens-Abbeville gap would be broken up in the open field, or else would have to capitulate for lack of food and ammunition. These were the hard and heavy tidings for which I called upon the House and the nation to prepare themselves a week ago. The whole root and core and brain of the British Army, on which and around which we were to build and are to build the great British armies in the later years of the war, seemed about to perish upon the field or be led into an ignominious and starving captivity. The enemy attacked us on all sides with great strength and fierceness, and their main power, the power of their far more numerous air force, was thrown into the battle or else concentrated upon Dunkirk and the beaches. Pressing in upon the narrow exit, both from the east and from the west, the enemy began to fire with cannon upon the beaches by which alone the shipping could approach or depart. They sowed magnetic mines in the channels and seas. They sent repeated waves of hostile aircraft, sometimes more than 100 strong in one formation, to cast their bombs upon the single pier that remained, and upon the sand dunes on which the troops had their only shelter. Their U-boats, one of which was sunk, and their motor launches took the toll of the vast traffic which now began. For 4 or 5 days an intense struggle reigned. All their armored divisions, or what was left of them, together with great masses of infantry and artillery, hurled themselves in vain upon the ever-narrowing, ever-contracting appendix within which the British and French armies fought. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy, with the willing help of countless merchant seamen, strained every nerve to embark the British and Allied troops. 220 light warships and 650 other vessels were engaged. They had to operate upon the difficult coast, often in adverse weather, under an almost ceaseless hail of bombs and an increasing concentration of artillery fire. Nor were the seas, as I have said, themselves free from mines and torpedoes. It was in conditions such as these that our men carried on with little or no rest, for days and nights on end, making trip after trip across the dangerous waters, bringing with them always men whom they had rescued. The numbers they have brought back are the measure of their devotion and their courage. The hospital ships which brought off many thousands of British and French wounded, being so plainly marked, were a special target for Nazi bombs, but the men and women on board them never faltered in their duty. Meanwhile, the Royal Air Force, which had already been intervening in the battle, so far as its range would allow, from our home bases, now used part of its main metropolitan fighter strength and struck at the German bombers and at the fighters which in large numbers protected them. This struggle was protracted and fierce. Suddenly the scene is cleared. The crash and thunder has for the moment, but only for the moment, died away. A miracle of deliverance achieved by valor, by perseverance, by perfect discipline, by faultless service, by resource, by skill, by unconquerable fidelity, is manifest to us all.
The main question is, was the battle a victory or defeat? And we can easily conclude that it was a bit of both. It was clearly a defeat because the French and the British were utterly defeated, driven to the beaches of Dunkirk, and if not for the evacuation, the entire British expeditionary force would have been lost. With that, most of the British equipment was dumped, ranging from tanks to even small arms, leaving British vulnerable for quite a while. It would very much be seen as a defeat because of the fact that the British concentrated on British soldiers, and so a majority was left behind. It was a victory, however, in that the evacuation itself happened and was a success. Though it had its cons, the Battle of Dunkirk was overall significant.
I'm Benjamin Richard Sheen, member of the Royal Corps of Signals. I served for 6.5 years, 2.5 years in Dover, where I was 20 years old. I was posted to Dover November of 1939. And later on I went to Normandy and landed on Juno Beach, not on D-Day, thank goodness, shortly after. There was a small detachment in Dover Castle. He worked in the gun control room there, 70 feet below the castle. When the Germans first took over France and the northern coast, they actually had an easy run through. Consequently, our army, 400,000 men, were trapped in Dunkirk. The problem was there was only a small jetty. They were able to get some of the men, but obviously being large ships, they couldn't get into the beach. Operation Dynamo was, I think, one of the main epics of the war, and I think it was certainly a turning point.
I've been on the beach for about 2.5, 3 days, had nothing to eat or anything like that, you know. My unit that I was with, we drove every lorry into the sea, and then we took the bridging equipment, being raw engineers, and put on top of the lorries so they could walk into deeper water to get onto boats. The Germans, they started to shell us, and I'm afraid that's when I lost most of my blokes, my unit.
I was 20 when that happened, but I think it brought back, I could see my old friends again, and a lot of them died later in the war. I went on convoys after that in the North Atlantic, and I lost many of my buddies.
And if it hadn't been for Operation Dynamo, you know, I think we'd been in a different situation in the world today. And can you imagine that, you know?
I think it's an experience that always lives with you.
I cried because it's never the end. It will happen. We are, as a human species, we are so intelligent with these astonishing things. We can fly to the moon, but we still do stupid things.